Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Nicholas Stang. He is Associate Professor in the Philosophy Department of the University of Toronto and also a Humboldt Research Fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin. His primary research interests are metaphysics and its history, mainly in German philosophy. While most of his published work has been about Kant, he is increasingly interested in pre-Kantian rationalism, Leibniz, Spinoza, and in post-Kantian figures, especially Hegel and Heidegger. He also works on contemporary metaphysics and aesthetics. His side interests include Jewish philosophy, early analytic philosophy, philosophy of mathematics, and critical theory. So, Dr. Stang, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, great. Today we're going to focus mostly on Kant's philosophy, particularly his metaphysics, his epistemology, and his ethics. And we're also going to try to establish relationships between the three of them. Starting with Kantian metaphysics, maybe also for the audience mostly, could you tell us first what the discipline of metaphysics is about? Probably some of the main questions that people try to answer there, and then the sort of approach that Kant had to it.
Okay, so the term metaphysics refers originally to a set of texts that we have from Aristotle. The term metaphysics was applied to those texts by later editors to indicate that they come after the physics in the order of the works of Aristotle. So the word metaphysics is not Aristotle's own word. It's a word that was later affixed to those works of Aristotle to indicate the kind of issues or the kinds of topics that are treated in those texts. And in those texts, the texts that we now call the metaphysics, Aristotle defines his topic as prima philosophia, or in some places, wisdom. And he characterizes the topic of first philosophy in at least two different ways. One, as the science of all beings qua beings, and secondly, as the science of a particular being, namely God. Now, ever since, metaphysics has had this slightly disjointed character, where in some cases it's taken to be the science of all beings, just in virtue of being beings, or what all beings have in common in virtue of being beings. And in some cases, it's taken to be the science of a particular kind of being, or a particular being, namely God. Now, if we fast forward to the 18th century, metaphysics is conceived, previous to Kant, there's a very important German philosopher named Christian Wolff, who is maybe not as well known to your audience because almost none of his works have been translated out of German or Latin. But he plays a very important role in German university philosophy in the 18th century because he takes the works of Leibniz, a previous German philosophy, and produces a kind of systematized version of them. Wolff's philosophy is not the same as Leibniz's philosophy, but it's very closely related to it. And he doesn't coin exactly, he introduces into common philosophical parlance a term for metaphysics, namely ontology, the study of being. And Wolff defines ontology in the same way Aristotle in some places defines first philosophy, the science of all beings as beings. Now, so metaphysics on the one hand is ontology, the science of all beings as beings, and then there's metaphysics of particular kinds of beings. So the German philosophy that Kant was educated in makes a distinction between general metaphysics, or ontology, the science of all beings as beings, and what they call special metaphysics, which is metaphysics of particular classes of beings. In Kant's way of thinking about it, the three most important topics of special metaphysics are the soul, the being that I, the thinking I am, the world, which is the totality of all beings in space and time, all beings created by God, and then God. So that we now have sort of this Kantian distinction between general metaphysics and special metaphysics reproduces in some way the original division within the Aristotelian texts between the definition of prima philosophia, or what we call metaphysics, as the science of all beings qua beings, and the science of the paramount being, God. So that is what, if you asked someone in Germany what metaphysics was about before the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason, that is what they would tell you. Now, within ontology or general metaphysics, the most important kinds of questions are questions. Let me first of all just say a little something about what general metaphysics or ontology is for the Germans before Kant. So, what does it mean to be a science of all beings qua being? Well, what does it mean to be a science? It means that metaphysics is not just a set of claims, a set of assertions, or a set of opinions. It's something like a set of claims that are taken to constitute knowledge, or Wissen, because a science in German is a Wissenschaft. It's a collection of Wissen. And it's not just an aggregate of individual claims to knowledge. It's a systematically ordered body of knowledge. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean it has to take the form of a contemporary axiomatic system, but metaphysics is supposed to proceed from principles to their conclusions. Okay. Now, what are the topics that are treated in the systematic body of knowledge that is supposed to be general metaphysics? Well, metaphysics is about all beings qua beings. What does that mean? Well, by contrast, physics is the science of movable beings insofar as they're movable. Okay? So it's about things that move in virtue of moving. Metaphysics is not just about the movable or about the immovable. It's not about the specifically about the spatiotemporal, but nor is it about the specifically non-spatiotemporal. It's about all beings whatsoever, anything that is just in virtue of which it is. So whereas physics might tell you about the laws of motion that govern matter, metaphysics is about something more general and more basic than that. For instance, what is it to be? What is it for something to cause another thing? What are the kinds of causes? Does everything have a cause? Those are the questions of general metaphysics. Special metaphysics is about the soul, the I that thinks, that Descartes claims to discover in the Meditations on First Philosophy. Whether that I that thinks is a substance, whether it is a thing, whether there is an I that thinks, whether the I that thinks is permanent over time or whether it can cease to exist, whether the I that thinks is a body, what its relationship to a body is if it is not a body, and then finally, arguably, I skipped a step. Cosmology is the second part of special metaphysics. That is the science of the cosmos, which is the organized whole of all beings that are not God. Okay? So the cosmos is everything that you are in spatiotemporal causal connection with, and everything in spatiotemporal causal connection with that. So all of this stuff. So the questions of cosmology would be questions such as, what is the principle of unity of the cosmos? Do the things in the cosmos causally interact, or do they merely appear to causally interact? Can there be more than one cosmos? Could God have created multiple mutually non-interacting cosmoses, or must all finite things constitute one cosmos? Is there free will, or does our causal embeddedness in the cosmos mean that every one of our actions has a completely determining cause? Those kinds of questions. And then finally, the highest object of special metaphysics is God. First of all, the primary thing that German metaphysicians will do in special metaphysics is try to prove that there is a God. And they will give various proofs of the existence of God. They will try to prove, for instance, that it follows from the very nature of God that he exists. Or they might try to prove that from the existence of a number of contingent finite things, it follows that there has to be an infinite necessarily existing being. Or they might argue that the evident designedness of the world requires that there be a designer. Those kinds of things, and then the compatibility of the existence of God with, say, our freedom, with the existence of the finite cosmos, the relationship between God and our soul, those are the topics of special metaphysics. Now, general metaphysics and special metaphysics relate in a very important way, which is that the concepts that you develop in general metaphysics are the very concepts that you need to use in special metaphysics. Because general metaphysics is the science of all beings qua beings. It's about absolutely everything there is, just in virtue of it being. So if you're going to think about the soul or the cosmos or God, you are absolutely going to have to use the concepts of general metaphysics to do that. So in a certain way, general metaphysics is the ground that makes possible special metaphysics. So as I said, that's something like, that's a sketch of metaphysics as Kant would have learned about it in his education at the University of Königsberg, and is something like the problem space of metaphysics that Kant was working in from, say, his first important work in metaphysics, The New Elucidation of the First Principles of Human Cognition from 1755, to sort of the eve of the publication of the first critique in 1781. So before I talk about how the critique of pure reason from 1781 kind of transforms that pre-Kantian conception of metaphysics, is there anything that you think I should clarify further?
Yeah, let me just ask you a couple of follow-ups, still focusing on metaphysics in general before we get into the Kantian approach.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in simpler terms, do you think it would be a fair assessment to say that metaphysics is interested in understanding what exists? I mean, what are the entities or the kinds of entities that are out there, their nature, I mean, what they are composed of, for example, and the relationships among them? I mean, would that be a fair summary?
Yes, that would be a fair summary, but that's a little too specific because it's very important to general metaphysics or ontology, as Kant's German predecessors and he himself understood it, that it's not just about what exists, but is also about what's possible. Mm-hmm. So the science of metaphysics doesn't study just what happens to exist, or even what necessarily exists. It studies the whole space of possible being. Mm-hmm. And in fact, so Wolff defines ontology as the study of ens, entia, beings, as ens, which in German is translated as Dinge, things, insofar as they're things. And his definition of a thing is a possible being. So the science of ontology is the science of all possibles insofar as they're possible. And possible here means not internally contradictory. So in ontology, or pre-Kantian ontology, we study the whole space of possible being, the whole space of internally consistent ways being could be configured. And one of the important concepts of ontology is existence, because some of those possible beings exist and others don't. But ontology isn't just about the existing ones, it's about all the possible ones.
Mm-hmm. But about the possible ones, I mean, when people talk about that, are they referring to something, some sort of entity that not yet exists, but that is allowed for by the structure of reality as it is? I mean, does it have to be something that can occur as the universe, for example, is structured?
So that's one of the things, that's a kind of hot topic in German metaphysics before Kant, whether everything that is possible will at some point be actual.
Mm-hmm.
Call that the modal plenitude thesis. If the modal plenitude thesis is true, it has a disturbing consequence. Take some action you don't commit. Right? So you could have told the truth, or you could have lied. You lied. This is an artifact. All of Kant's examples are examples in which you do something bad. Okay? So you lie. It's never the case that at that time you told the truth. But the modal plenitude thesis would entail that everything that's possible happens at some point. But since by hypothesis it never happens that at that moment you tell the truth, then it's impossible for you to have told the truth. Which means that everything that happens is such that the not happening of it at the time at which it happened is impossible. Which means that everything that happens is necessary. So if everything that's possible happens at some point, then all the things that actually happen are necessary. That's very disturbing for precisely the kinds of example that I'm talking about. It would entail that everything that you do is necessary. People are at pains in this period to avoid that conclusion because they think it will deprive them of moral responsibility for what they do. But that's just a sort of taste of the kinds of issues involved in metaphysics. So you might think possible means will happen at some point, but that has unpleasant consequences. So the philosophers that Kant is educated by, to a large extent, want to hold that there are things that are possible in the sense that they're internally consistent, which never happen, precisely to maintain the possibility of your having done otherwise than you actually do, and thereby retain some kind of moral responsibility for what you do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last follow-up about metaphysics. In terms of modern metaphysics, I mean, because nowadays we live in a world that is dominated from an epistemological perspective by the scientific method that is basically based on materialism and naturalism. I guess that what would be most relevant from a metaphysical standpoint would be the knowledge that comes from physics, right? That is the fundamental nature of reality, and in this case we know about the atoms and the subatomic particles and all of that. I mean, is it that nowadays philosophical metaphysics is in any way constrained by the knowledge that we gather from physics, or does it go beyond that?
So I don't think that the situation is fundamentally different than it was for Kant, because Kant was intimately familiar with a very sophisticated, although now to some extent surpassed, piece of physical theory, namely Newton's theory of gravitation. And Kant himself thought that the relationship between physics and metaphysics was that such that metaphysicians, philosophers, as we now use the term, whatever else they might do, should not take themselves to be refuting or calling into question the results of science when science is properly done. So Kant thinks that mathematics and Newtonian natural science is to some extent perfectly fine within its domain, and a philosopher would make themselves foolish if they tried to argue something that was incompatible with either of these, the results of either of these sciences within their own domain. So just to take an example, certain German philosophers before Kant wanted to argue that space can't be continuously divisible, contrary to what one can prove in geometry. Kant thought geometry just shows that that view is wrong. Likewise, you might think that, say, some philosophers would think that bodies can't interact at a distance. They can't attract each other at a distance. Kant thought Newtonian physics just shows that to be wrong. So Kant is himself, familiar with very sophisticated modern mathematical natural science, and doesn't think that the role of metaphysics or philosophy is to undermine or to question or could ever undermine the properly understood results of physics. But Kant thinks that natural science doesn't exhaust the domain of metaphysics, because there's a huge amount that physics doesn't answer. In fact, it doesn't answer really any of the metaphysical questions. It doesn't tell you what causation is. It tells you a law of certain kinds of causal interactions, but it doesn't tell you what it is for one thing to cause another. In Kantian terms, it doesn't tell you how causation is possible, why it's possible for one thing to produce, not even through touching another thing, a change in it. Natural science doesn't explain why mathematics is applicable to the natural world. Now, if you think that the possibility of natural science depends upon applying mathematics to the natural world and uncovering the laws that describe causal relations among things, if you can't explain why mathematics is applicable to the natural world, and you can't explain what causation is, much less how causation is possible, then you haven't explained how natural science is possible, which is a way of saying that Kant thinks that natural science can do all kinds of great things. It is entirely master in its own realm, and it's not the job of the philosopher to step in and say, oh, but that isn't right. What natural science can't explain is how natural science is possible. Why it's possible for us, through doing what we do in natural science, to find out not just some facts, but some explanations. Not just to know what happens, but what has to happen given the laws of nature. So from Kant's point of view, the progress of natural science doesn't and cannot possibly render unnecessary metaphysics. Because one of the crucial things that metaphysics does is explain how natural science itself is possible. So in a certain way, I think that all of that is right, and that the metaphysician should never understand themselves as competing with the claims of the physicist at the first order. If the physicist tells us space-time has this structure, that is just what we should theorize from. If the physicist tells us that, say, quantum states work in a certain way, then we should just accept that and theorize from that. But none of that stuff will answer by itself will answer the really persistent metaphysical questions about what it is for something to be at all, what it is for one thing to cause another, how causation is possible, nor will it explain how natural science itself is possible, how we can come to know the kinds of things we purport to know in natural science. So in a certain way, I don't think that the further progress of natural science by itself makes any changes the relationship between natural science and metaphysics. It does create a problem for Kant's own views about metaphysics, because Kant's own views about metaphysics commit him to space and time having a certain structure and natural science itself having a certain form, which we've learned in the subsequent centuries, space-time doesn't have that form, it doesn't have that structure, and natural science needn't have that form. Mm-hmm. So that's a complicated way of saying that, abstracting from Kant's parochial and specific mathematical and scientific commitments in the 18th century, the basic form of the problem that he's interested in, how is metaphysics possible? And in particular, how does metaphysics explain the possibility of natural science, has, I think, not changed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I think that I guess that you understand why I asked you that
Yep.
question, because since we live in a world that is dominated by the scientific method
Yep.
at the level of epistemology, let's say, I mean, probably there are many scientists, particularly physicists out there, that would say that all that exists is only the material things that that we can approach
Yep.
empirically or that we can validate empirically.
Let me I just pause you right there.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. A lot of people would say that. But their reason for saying that is those are all and only the things that natural science gives us a reason to believe. But to get from that to the conclusion that's all the things there are, you need an intermediary premise. Every all and only the things natural science tells you about are the things there are. What's the source of that? That's a metaphysical claim. It's not a claim that why is it a metaphysical claim? Because it's above and it's more general than any science. There is no if you want to know, is everything material? What is the science that's going to answer that question? Well, can you ask the material scientists? No, because they by definition only study materials. So of course everything they study is made up. Ask the physicists. Okay, everything physical, everything that physics studies is made up of matter and energy. But that doesn't entail that everything is made up of matter and energy unless everything there is physical. And whether everything is physical is just not a question for physics. You cannot get a Nobel Prize in physics by answering the question, does physics tell you about everything there is? That's not a question that a physicist can even approach. It's just, that is a question for metaphysics. Now, that is a view you can have in metaphysics, that all there is the physical. That's a view that people call physicalism. But it's not that the natural sciences have somehow replaced metaphysics or displaced it. It's just that we've kind of forgotten that in addition to all of the things the natural sciences tell us, there's this overarching question. Is that all there is?
Yeah.
And just to make that question come alive, in order to do any serious physics, you need very sophisticated mathematics. You need to talk about all kinds of things that do not look like they're in any way physical. Functions, sets, etc. So it looks like physics itself, on the most obvious construals, and there is enormously sophisticated work about that. So I'm just kind of skating over the surface here. It looks like physics, in order to get off the ground, needs to talk about things that are themselves not physical, namely abstract mathematical items. So it looks like the barest version of physicalism, in which all there is like space-time and some fields, is inadequate to physics itself. Now, of course, a lot of physicalists will tell me that that's oversimplified, which it is, and false, which it may be. But that's just some reason to think that the further progress of physics, or natural science more generally, not only hasn't displaced the need for metaphysics, but in principle can't. There's no imaginable further discovery of physics that would foreclose off all of the questions of metaphysics. Because the questions of metaphysics just aren't at the same level as the questions of physics. That was the point earlier. I think Kant thinks that as long as the physicists are sort of doing physics and not sort of speculating about the metaphysical, the role of the metaphysician should just be to take their results at face value, maybe ask metaphysical questions about them, such as, how should we interpret this? What sense do we make of that? A lot of the best contemporary philosophy of physics is metaphysics guided by the best contemporary physics. But those people who know more about physics than anyone in philosophy, as far as I can tell, don't think that the physical theories themselves, by themselves, answer the metaphysical questions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's just that you certainly know that there are some scientists that even go as further as to say that philosophy in general nowadays is obsolete because all of the relevant questions that we have to answer can be either approached in a naturalistic, materialistic way, or we can't answer them at all. And so, for example, in metaphysics, questions regarding God and the soul, and if the soul is immortal or not, and even if you don't care about the soul and only talk about human psychology and things like consciousness, I mean, many people through the naturalistic scientific method would simply say that, I mean, if someday we understand how those kinds of things work and if they exist or not, like God, we would have to reduce them to their physical, material aspects.
Okay, so two things about that. I'll just take that in roughly the opposite order in which you said it. The idea that if any of these things are sort of intellectually respectable topics on which cognitively contentful things can be said and people can give arguments even if disagreements, which is something like the minimal preconditions, not for a science in the contemporary sense, maybe for a Wissenschaft in the German sense, but at least for something like a rational inquiry. The idea that that requires that the topics of that inquiry be themselves materially constituted, made up of matter and energy, is simple. I mean, what's so ironic about that, that's simply a claim in metaphysics. That is just simply not something that any science is going to tell you. So the denial of metaphysics often has this slightly ironic structure that's formulated as a claim in metaphysics, right? So my attitude is, well, okay, once you've made that claim, you've sort of jumped over into this other inquiry, and then let's just have that conversation within that inquiry. Secondly, it indicates that in a certain way, metaphysics is unavoidable. So which gets me to the other point, which is the questions of metaphysics aren't just these kind of historical remnants, and they're not just things that kind of one speculates about while staring up at the starry heavens, on a clear night. They're questions that emerge within other rational inquiries, within other sciences, just in virtue of our being rational beings, but which exceed the bounds of those rational inquiries. So you're going along doing physics. Okay? Here's a question that physics does not itself answer. What is physics, and what are its limits? What is the boundary between physical theory and, say, non-physical theory, say superphysical theory or a metaphysical theory, and then some science which is maybe more specific than physical theory, like chemistry? At least on the side of the external boundary of the physical, that is not a question that physics itself answers, but is a question that arises within physics. It arises within physics. Wait, is that even a question for physics to answer? Or have we exceeded the limits of the intelligible when we ask some question about what a law of nature is, or why are there laws of nature in the first place? That's a kind of question that you can't really answer within physics, but it arises out of physics itself. Now, why does it arise out of physics itself? Because it is an instance of the exercise of our rationality, where our rationality is something like, this is super Kantian, it's something like the capacity and the demand for explanations, to ask why questions. So we're engaged in physical theorizing, we're trying to discover laws. Okay? Now we ask ourselves, what is it for something to be a law? And why are there laws? That is an exercise of the very same rational capacity, the search for explanations, which exercised within physics gets you good physical theories. Right? Physics is an exercise of rationality. You look for answers to why questions. Why do the planets move the way they do? Why do we get this pattern on a cloud shape? But then we ask another kind of why question, and we exceed the bounds of physics. So that just shows that these questions about metaphysics kind of erupt within science itself. They erupt or arise within rational inquiry that's constrained in such a way that it can constitute a proper science. Metaphysics you might think of as the attempt to exercise reason beyond or above or outside of the conditions that constitute what we now call a science, namely something that reliably produces knowledge and approximates towards the truth asymptotically over time. So just to sum, that was a whole lot of thoughts all at once, but just to sum that up, that's to suggest that metaphysics is an exercise of the very same thing, the very same rational capacity that science is an exercise of, but without the restrictions that, in the case of science, turn that exercise of a rational capacity into something that reliably produces better and better approximations to the empirical truth. There's no reason to think that that sort of excessive use of reason gets you nonsense or isn't about anything, unless you've already engaged in something at that level. You've already made a claim that the only thing there is the stuff that can be known about through reason exercised within the appropriate boundaries that get you a natural science. So the only way to sort of cut metaphysics off as it flowers out of science is itself to engage in metaphysics. So it's unavoidable in that way. And then finally, you might think, as a lot of people in the early 20th century did, the logical positivists, that once reason, or once we try to formulate these questions that exceed the limits or the boundaries in which reason generates a natural science, that is to say, a thing that approximates to empirical truth over time, that what we said is meaningless. Right? So maybe these why questions, once they are no longer why questions within a particular science, just, it's not that they don't have answers because we can't know about them, they just don't mean anything. Well, once again, an explanation needs to be given of why that is. That's an argument that needs to be made.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now getting more specifically into Kantian philosophy, I mean, we have been talking about metaphysics, and that's mostly about what exists, what's the nature of reality, of being. But, I mean, there's always an associated question that is, okay, so there's something out there, but can we know it? What is the limit? What are the limits of our knowledge? Yeah. So, I mean, and Kant had these two very interesting concepts, that is the noumenon and the phenomenon. So could you tell us about that? Okay,
great. So to understand Kant's notion of noumena and phenomena, or the singulars being noumenon and phenomenon, we have to understand a more basic distinction that Kant makes between two capacities or faculties that our mind has. One of them is called understanding, and the other one is called sensibility. Mm-hmm. So what is a capacity? It's something like an ability. It's an ability that can be exercised under different conditions, and is provoked into activation by various kinds of stimuli. So what is understanding? That's the capacity to form concepts, general concepts, and combine them into judgments, and then to make inferences involving those judgments. So just to take a toy example, Greek is a concept, it's a general term. Athenian is a general term. Mortal is a general term. So those are concepts. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I can do with the understanding is put those concepts together in such a way that I say all Athenians are mortal. All Athenians are Greek. Sorry, all Athenians are Greek. I could also say all Greeks are mortal. That's another combination of concepts that I can make. But having combined those concepts in that way, I could also then infer from that all Athenians are mortal, because they're all Greeks. Okay. So now we have the three things that concepts allow us to do. Allow us to have a general term, Greek, Athenian, mortal, put them into judgments, and draw conclusions and inferences. But if that was the only capacity that our mind had, according to Kant, we would never produce any knowledge, or we would never produce any substantive knowledge, because all we could do is unpack our concepts and notice relations among our concepts. So for instance, it might be built into the concept of, say, Greek, that Greeks are human beings. The concept Greek is the concept of human being who lives in this part of Europe. Yeah. But if that's all we could do, we wouldn't really know anything because we wouldn't know whether these objects were empty or not. We wouldn't know whether there were any Greeks. We wouldn't know whether there was a Europe. We would just have these concepts. In fact, we wouldn't even know that it was possible for anything to fall into these concepts because all we would know is that these concepts were logically consistent, that they didn't contain any contradictions. And Kant, unlike some of the guys I was talking about before, did not think that logical consistency was sufficient for possibility. Okay? So understanding on its own is very minimal. So Kant thinks we have to have another capacity of our mind, which he calls sensibility. He calls it sensibility because he thinks it's passive. It's something, it requires something from the outside to affect us. Understanding, by contrast, is spontaneous. I combine concepts into judgments. No one makes me do it. I'm the judger. I judge. Sensibility is receptive. Something has to strike me from outside. And as a result of that, in sensibility, we don't get concepts, which are general terms that apply to potentially many things because of those things having the properties contained in the concept. We get what Kant calls intuitions, which are of individual things. They're singular and they're immediate. That is to say, my intuition of a thing is an immediate mental relation to it. It's a mental relation to it that isn't mediated by some other representation of it. For instance, a mental image or some property of the thing, such that I intuit it by way of its having some general property. And it's singular because my intuition is always of one and only one thing. So Kant thinks when we put these two things together, we start getting something like knowledge. Because now with intuition, I can mentally be related to a single object and think it under a concept. And so now those conceptual judgment relations and inferential relations that I was talking about before can now be brought to bear on objects. I can now not just think all Athenians are Greek. I can think of Constantine, that he is an Athenian. And I can think not just all Athenians are Greek, all Greeks are mortal, therefore all Athenians are mortal. I can think of Constantine, that he's Athenian, and therefore must be Greek, and therefore must be mortal. So now I can bring objects under my concepts, my judgments, my inferences, and now I know something about objects. But I know something only about the objects that I'm related to intuitively. That is to say, to which I have this singular mental relation, intuition, which occurs because of some kind of affection. I don't generate from my mind the objects that I'm singularly related to in intuition. Something has to happen to me from outside. Now, the notion of the distinction between phenomena and noumena is just, it can be defined very easily. A phenomenon is just something that, it's the object of some intuition that's possible for us. It's an intuitable by us object. Mm-hmm. And a noumenon is something that cannot be intuited by us. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that something else can intuit it, but we can't intuit it. So Kant thinks that knowledge requires concept and intuition. We can only know about the objects that we not only have concepts of, but we can intuit. So we can only know about phenomena. Noumena are the objects that we at least can't intuit, so we can't have any knowledge of them. Okay? So now that's the meaning of that terminology. Okay? Now I've described it in an extremely abstract way, but it becomes less abstract when Kant argues near the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason that all of our intuition, all of our immediate singular mental acquaintance with an object that allows us to subsume the object under concepts, gives us or acquaints us with objects in space and time. Okay? So we have two different kinds of intuition for Kant. We have outer intuition of objects that are not states of our minds, and we have inner intuition of the states of our minds. So I can be singularly acquainted with objects in space that are outside me and objects that are in time that are in states of my mind. Consequently, everything that I can have knowledge of, not just concept, but intuition as well, put together to make knowledge, is in space or time. But Kant argues in the same part of the Critique of Pure Reason that space and time are not the way things are independently of my mind. So this is where things start getting sort of complicated and verbose in the standard Kantian way. Kant thinks that space and time are forms or structures in which things appear to me. Okay? So that nothing that I intuit in space or time exists independently of my mind. Okay? So that means that all the objects that I intuit in space and time are appearances of objects that exist independently of my mind and are not in space and time. Okay? So Kant has this argument that I won't go through now because it's highly controversial and complicated and confusing, that the objects that I intuit are not what Kant calls things in themselves. Okay? Now, thing in itself is this incredibly strange word in Kant that produces all of this. It's not one word, it's a phrase, Dinge an sich selbst. But it produces all this confusion in Kant's readers. And the reason it produces all this confusion is because Kant introduces it in the course of the part of the Critique of Pure Reason called the Transcendental Aesthetic without explaining what it means. He just kind of drops it. And so people think, oh, what could this possibly mean? I think the reason Kant drops it into the text is because he thinks it's supposed to be, he thinks that his audience will understand what he means by it, because he means something very straightforward by it. A thing in itself is what we, before we do philosophy, or at least before we read the Critique of Pure Reason, always already think objects around us are. Right? Before we do philosophy, we think this glass of water exists whether or not I intuit it, whether or not I experience it, and it has at least its core physical properties independently of whether any mind like ours experiences it. It has a certain shape, height, width, volume, mass, causal powers, etc., independently of our minds. So Kant, that's what Kant means by a thing in itself, or things in themselves. Things that exist and have their core physical properties independently of our minds. So in denying that the objects that we intuit are things in themselves, Kant is denying that. Okay? So what he's saying is that what we intuit are not things as they are in themselves. We intuit the appearances of those things. So things in themselves appear to us as objects in space and time. So in particular, space and time are neither things in themselves, nor are they forms or structures of things in themselves. So just to give you some kind of contrast, this is a little bit complicated by the fact that Newton and Leibniz actually had much, much more complicated and sophisticated views about these matters than even I think Kant was sometimes aware. But the very most sort of straightforward reading of Newton, which may have been Kant's reading, holds Newton as thinking that space is just a thing. There's all the bodies in space, and then there's space. It's just this big container. So in the Kantian way of thinking about it, Newton thinks space is a thing in itself. So he's denying that at least by denying that space is a thing in itself. Then there are these other guys like Wolff who read Leibniz and have this view that space isn't a thing in addition to all the bodies in space. It's just the order of relations among the things. So you basically just have objects or bodies that are spatially related, and space is something like the system of all their possible relations. But it's a system of possible relations of what Kant would call things in themselves. So when Kant denies that space is a thing in itself or a form of things in themselves, he's denying both of those views. It's not that there's space, this thing in itself, that a bunch of other things in themselves are in, nor is space the structure or the system of relations that all the things in themselves are in. It's on our side of things. There's things in themselves, they affect us or trigger us to intuit. And what we intuit is objects in space, where the reason they're in space is something about the nature of our minds. It's because of the nature of our minds that the things in themselves trigger us to intuit objects in space. Space isn't on the side of the things in themselves. It's conceivable that there are other kinds of minds that the things in themselves trigger to intuit objects not in space and time, but in some other structure. So this is what Kant means by saying that space and time are subjective forms of intuition, or subjective forms of sensibility. It's a subjective, that is to say, parochial feature about the kinds of minds that we have, that the forms in which we intuit objects are time, in the case of our mental states, and space, in the case of objects that are not our mental states. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, but wait, don't I also, he says as he moves the glass slowly across the screen, don't I also see or intuit objects in space, in time? Isn't time also out here? Yes, but Kant thinks its primary home is in our mental states, and then you have to do a complicated mental operation to also kind of project it out into space. But that's more controversial and extremely complicated, and I don't want to get into that. So noumena and phenomena is a contrast between objects in terms of what kind of mind can intuit them. A phenomenon is an object that can be intuited by a mind like ours, that's receptive. Right? It's a receptively intuitable object. Noumenon is something that cannot be receptively or sensibly intuited. No mind that requires affection or triggering from outside to intuit can intuit a noumenon. Appearance and thing in itself is a different distinction, but lines up with phenomena and noumena. So appearance is the term for these objects that we intuit in space and time. An appearance is something like the subjective way that a thing in itself appears to us, while a thing in itself is, the concept of a thing in itself is the concept of a thing that exists and has its core properties independently of our mind or any mind like ours. But these distinctions line up. So what the appearances are is phenomena. Right? The phenomena, the things that we can intuit, are appearances, not things in themselves. And the things in themselves are noumena. They're things that can't be sensibly intuited by us. And in fact, it probably goes the other way, but it's less important for Kant that all the noumena, all the things we can't sensibly intuit, are also things in themselves. But that's a separate issue. So that was a lot. Maybe you have some follow-up questions.
Yes, it's a bit complicated, a bit tricky, particularly because we are talking about some things that are counterintuitive for us. But let me ask you this. So, two questions maybe. The first one is, would it be correct to say that Kant says then that we are epistemologically limited in terms of what we can know about the world and the knowledge that we can produce about it, both by the way our cognitive mechanisms operate, particularly at the level of conceptualization, and by the way our senses work, and the information we can gather from the world, let's say. Is that correct? And then the second question would be, since he uses the words appearance and thing in itself, are those things both real but different metaphysical entities, or is the noumena or the things in themselves what reality really is, and we only have access to the phenomena?
Okay, great. So it's really important to note that Kant thinks. Okay, so I said this earlier, but I said it too quickly, and I should emphasize this. So first of all, it should be emphasized that all of the things that I'm saying about Kant are to some extent interpretively controversial. Some people would disagree with parts of it, so I'm giving you my reading of these things. I've tried to remain relatively neutral. I have tried to sort of say some things that any any Kantian would agree with, although they might put the weight on different places. So that's just necessary proviso. Secondly, Kant has this complicated set of epistemological terms that don't correspond particularly well with ours. So in contemporary epistemology, people spend a lot of time worrying about what it is to believe something and what the difference between belief and knowledge is, and what additional epistemic standing a belief has to have to constitute knowledge, or maybe whether knowledge is a more basic state than belief. Those, in any case, are the terms in which contemporary epistemology is largely conducted. Or another way of putting that is epistemology today cuts things up in terms of belief, knowledge, justification, warrant, evidence. It's not clear that Kant's way of carving up epistemology corresponds particularly well to the contemporary way of carving up epistemology, which means that there's a kind of what you might think of as a kind of boring scholarly lesson that arises from that, which is we have to kind of understand Kant's epistemology on its own terms. But there's a more interesting philosophical point that arises from that, which I won't try to pursue further today because I'm not sure I'm knowledgeable enough to do so, which is if we have to ask ourselves whether Kant's way of carving up the terrain of epistemology is better or worse than our way of carving up the terrain. So just because he carves up the terrain differently than we do doesn't mean that his way of carving up things is artificial. Ours might turn out to be the artificial one. In any case, the way Kant articulates these notions is in terms of a distinction between what he calls, he uses two different terms here, not always making clear that they actually mean something different. One of which is cognition or erkenntnis, and the other one of which is knowledge or wissen. Now, it's relatively clear that cognition is the thing that happens when we bring concept and intuition together. Okay? We cognize something when we intuit an object and we bring it under a concept. That's the core case. More complicated cases are possible as well. Now, because we can't intuit things in themselves, we can't cognize them. Now we ask, well, can we have wissen of them? Can we know anything about them? Kant repeatedly denies that we can know anything about things themselves. Okay? Why can't we know anything about things themselves? Because Kant seems to be of the view that knowledge is constrained by cognition. To know something, you have to be able to intuit the relevant objects and bring them under concepts. Now, once again, some complication is allowed there. It might be that because of the particular sense organs you have, you can't directly perceive those objects, although you can infer their existence from some other object. And were you to have slightly different sense organs, say eyes that could see a different part of the electromagnetic spectrum, you would be able to directly perceive them. Those still count as intuitable in the broader sense in which Kant means intuitable. There's still objects in space and time that are appearances of things in themselves. Okay, so cognition seems to sort of put this outer condition on wissen, on knowledge. Of all the things that we can cognize, only some of them do we know. And so if we can't cognize things in themselves, we can't know anything about them. That's something like the simplest model of thinking about these things in Kant. However, Kant, of course, this is like the first thing that people noticed about a critique of theory is that Kant says we can't know anything about things in themselves, but then makes all these claims about them, like that they exist, that they affect our sensibility, producing intuition, that they are not in space and time. So what are the status of these claims if they're not knowledge? Now that is, I think, a big open question in Kant scholarship. There's two ways that Kant can be read on this, and I'm not going to commit myself today because I'm genuinely not sure how I want to think about this. One, when Kant denies that we can know anything about things in themselves, what he means is we can't know anything about things in themselves beyond the fact that they exist, that they causally affect us if they're not in space and time. That's this incredibly trivial knowledge we have them. We don't have any more substantive knowledge. The other possibility is that Kant has a more restricted notion of knowledge than we do, right? This apparent paradox that Kant makes substantive claims about things in themselves while claiming not to know anything about them seems like a paradox because we assume that the norm of assertion is knowledge. That is to say, when Kant makes an assertion about things in themselves, he's presenting himself. He's communicating to us a knowledge claim about them. But that might not be Kant's view. In particular, and this is why it becomes important that Kant's epistemological terminology may not be ours, Wissen might not really be exactly what we mean by knowledge, because Wissen may not be the norm of assertion according to Kant. So Kant might be asserting something without claiming to have Wissen of it. So that sort of Wissen is this much stronger or more demanding thing than mere knowledge, what we call knowledge. Now, there's reason to think that that would be a very reasonable thing for Kant to think, because there's a very tight connection both etymologically and philosophically for people in this period between Wissen, knowledge, maybe, and Wissenschaft, science. So when Kant denies that we can have Wissen of things in themselves, what he might mean is not that we can't know anything about them in the contemporary sense, but that we can't have a Wissenschaft of them. We can't have, just to go back to where I started, a scientifically or rationally ordered body of knowledge of them from principles. So that those things that we know about things in themselves, that they're not spatiotemporal, they causally affect us, and that they exist, don't count as Wissen because they're part of no Wissenschaft. Because there's no ordered body of knowledge from principles in which they fit. These are just kind of these three random aggregate things that we happen to know about things in themselves because we do this Kantian epistemological project from at the side of our subjectivity. So those are two ways of thinking about the Kant's way of drawing up the territory of epistemology and why it might be consistent for him to make substantive claims about things themselves while denying that those claims themselves constitute knowledge. Different scholars will go different ways. And some people will think that the thing that I've just said is mistaken from the ground up. Now, to go to your other question, so regardless, so just big moral of the story there, regardless of how you go, there's at least some very serious epistemic barrier on one side of which is the objects in space and time, the phenomena, on the other which is things in themselves. We either know nothing about them or we have very, very limited knowledge of them. We either have some Wissen of them, but it's very trivial, or we have no Wissen because we have no Wissenschaft of them. Okay, now you said something about is this because the limitations of our conceptual scheme? It's really important feature of Kant that the source of the limitation of our Wissen is not our concepts, it's our intuitions. The reason that we don't have knowledge of things in themselves is because we can't intuit them. Mm-hmm. We just have concepts of them. So Kant's epistemic restriction of knowledge to appearances and leaving things in themselves open, epistemically open, is not the result of some relatively homely reflection on the contingency of our conceptual scheme, et cetera, et cetera. That by itself wouldn't get you to the kind of the principled epistemic restriction Kant gets on knowledge of things themselves, objects that exist independently of minds like ours. Secondly, it's also really important to distinguish Kant's epistemology, or his epistemological restrictions on knowledge of things in themselves, with some view to the effect that, well, the human sensibility, the visual faculty is evolved to do certain things well and other things not well, right? So people sometimes conflate Kant's epistemic restriction on knowledge to appearances rather than things themselves with some stuff that you might get from contemporary cognitive science, right? So, it's like these kind of like clickbaity articles about how some cognitive scientist has proven that the world that we experience is some kind of illusion. None of those are the claims that Kant is making. Because if you just think about the structure of that claim in cognitive science, it's some claim of the form, well, the three-dimensional or, however 13-dimensional string theoretic universe around us beams certain kinds of sensory information into our sense organs, and then our brain basically reconstructs, using various kinds of heuristics, a model of the perceptual environment. And obviously there's going to be a huge amount of information loss from the signal to the model, and obviously our brain, which is the product of evolution, is going to have learned how to construct these models using various heuristics that are generally workable in our environment, and hence not going to be accurate in all cases, and B, generally serve the evolutionary fitness of our kind of organism, namely to avoid predators, find food, and mate. I mean, that's very, very crude sketch of evolution and cognitive theory. But the structure of that, the very structure of that theory is the cognitive scientist is making a claim about our brain as an object in space and time that's basically an information processing kind of thing, and then this larger environment in which it's made. So that claim is precisely, that's a piece of natural science. That's a claim about objects in space and time, according to Kant. So no Kantian claim about the distinction between things in themselves and appearances, or the restriction of our knowledge to the former as opposed to the latter, should be conflated with any claim in empirical cognitive science or psychology or anything like that about the dependence of our perceptual beliefs on our perceptual faculties, anything like that. Or another way of thinking about this is the cognitive scientist who tells you, oh, our perceptual experience is an illusion or it's a virtual reality, makes that claim on the basis of thinking that they can say something using all of their instruments in their lab setup about the physical world outside of that perceptual illusion. Well, Kant thinks he can't, or he can't do so with knowledge. All we can know, and we maybe can't even know, is that there are these things, they causally affect us, and they're non-spatially temporal. So that's just a way of saying that Kant's epistemological restrictions should not be conflated with, on the one side, a kind of homely, you might think of it as like kind of undergraduate point that like, oh, those are just our concepts, we could have had different concepts, because the source of the epistemic restriction for Kant is not concepts, it's intuition. And secondly, it can't be conflated with any, even very sophisticated piece of empirical cognitive science, because the empirical cognitive science distinction is operating within what Kant would call the phenomenal world, the world of appearances in space and time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then for Kant, there's another faculty of the human mind that he calls reason.
Yep.
And in the later part of the Critique of Pure Reason, he talks about the antinomies of reason. And I'm bringing this topic up because then later on I will want to establish a bridge between this part and his ethics. So, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess that in the book what he identifies as the antinomies are if the that we can't know through reason if the universe is infinite or not, both in terms of time and space, that is, if the universe has existed forever or not, and if it is spatially infinite. We can't know for sure if the soul is immortal, if God exists, and if we have, I guess, what we could call nowadays free will. I guess that those are at least four of the big antinomies that he identifies, right?
Exactly. So I earlier distinguished these two different Kantian faculties: sensibility, the passive capacity to have intuitions, that is to stand in singular and immediate cognitive relation to an object, and concept, which is, or understanding, which is the spontaneous capacity to think of objects under concepts, to form judgments. When you put those two capacities together, you get what Kant calls cognition. And when cognition is of empirical objects, that is to say, objects that just happen to be given to us in space and time, objects that are not the very structure of space and time, but objects that happen to be in space and time, like my hands and the objects on this desk, the objects you see on this screen. When we subsume those objects under concepts, we have experience. So experience in Kantese is empirical cognition. It's bringing empirical objects under concepts. Now, we have a third faculty, reason, which, just to go back to what I was talking about earlier, I was saying that metaphysics arises naturally within natural science because it's exercise of the very same faculty, namely reason, that's operated in natural science. That's a super Kantian way of thinking about reason, because Kant thinks of reason as the capacity for searching for conditions. Okay? So in cognition or experience, we find an object and we understand it in a particular way. We think of it under a concept. We maybe judge of it that it falls under some concept. Reason requires us to search for an explanation for that, to find another object that explains why that object is the way it is, to find its condition. Okay. Now, reason has a kind of, unlike sensibility and understanding, unlike intuition and concept, the role of reason is regulative. It doesn't tell us how things are, it tells us how we rationally are to proceed. Look for conditions, search for conditions. Okay. So so what is a condition? It's something that explains something else, called, unhelpfully, a condition. It is sometimes more helpful to think of a condition as a ground. Okay? That's a term that Kant would have used in his previous philosophical career. For complicated reasons, he prefers the term condition in the first critique. Well, what is a ground or what is a condition? Well, there's different relationships that a ground or a condition can stand into what it grounds or conditions. So here are 5 conditioning relations that Kant is interested in. One, the relationship between a larger space and a space of which a space it contains. Okay? So Kant thinks that parts of space are grounded in or conditioned by larger spaces. So it's not like the whole space is made up of little spaces. On the contrast, the bigger space makes the smaller spaces possible. So there's big space to little space, that's the first conditioning relation. Then there's a period of time to a previous period, a period of time that includes it and an earlier period of time. So there's kind of like the year 1999, and then there's the year 1998 to 1999, right? So once again, the larger period of time that also includes an earlier bit is the condition of, or the ground of, the smaller piece of time that's also later. So that's another conditioning relation that Kant is interested in. A third conditioning relation is the relationship between the parts, and a whole. So Kant thinks this pen is conditioned by or grounded in. Its being is explained in part by its parts. I wish I could take this pen apart, but I actually can't figure out how to disassemble it right now. That was a bad choice. And then thirdly, the relationship between a cause and an effect is a conditioning relation. A cause is a condition. It explains why the effect happens. And then finally, this is basically just a variance on the fourth one. The relationship between a contingent thing, a thing that exists but might not have existed, and a thing that necessitates its existence, is a relationship between a conditioned and a condition, between a consequence and a ground. So the ground is the thing that makes this necessary, and the consequence is the contingent thing. So those are 5 relationships of ground to consequence, of condition to condition. Now, what is reason? Reason is this faculty in us that drives us to go from conditioned to condition, from consequence to ground. Now, what does it mean that it drives us? It means that it has an inner teleology. You are insufficiently rational if you are not looking for grounds for consequences of things you experience. Okay? So reason issues us a directive. look for grounds. Okay. Now, so we have all these objects in space and time that we experience. Every object in space and time, what is it to be an object in space and time? It's to be an appearance of things in themselves. And it's to be a phenomenon. It's to be an object of sensible intuition. Right? It's to be something that could be presented to us in space or time and thereby be the appearance of a thing in itself to us. Okay? So all the objects of experience, all the objects in space and time, are objects we could in principle intuit. Now, our sense organs, vision, taste, they're very limited. So not all the objects in space and time are things that we could see, okay? But they're things that we could in principle intuit because we could have some sort of sense organ that directly presents those things to us in space and time. So the limits of spatiotemporal intuition are not the limits of human sense organs. They're a generalization of that. Okay? So if you imagine all of our Martian cousins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, who don't intuit, who don't have vision or taste and touch or anything like that, but maybe have electromagnetic seeing or immediate gravitational sensing, as long as what they intuit is in space and time, they still have spatiotemporal intuition. Okay, so now, reason requires us to think of conditions for every condition. But it tricks itself into thinking that so given some condition, we have to think of its condition, and then we have to think of the condition of that, and we have to think of the condition of that. Reason makes a mistake because it assumes that the complete sequence of those conditions exists. Okay? So reason has to think of some x, that there's a ground of x, and then there's a ground of the ground of x. But it tricks itself into thinking that there's a single there's a single totality of all of those conditions. And that's where what Kant calls the antinomies arise from. Okay, so let's just go back a second. So there's these various grounding relations. Mm-hmm. And reason is this faculty that requires us to search for grounds. Okay? And so it requires us to search for grounds, and grounds for grounds and grounds, and so on. But it assumes that everything that has a ground also has a complete totality of all the grounds. Okay? It assumes, for instance, that there's this thing called all of the grounds of a given consequence. Okay? Now, for each of those 5 grounding relations, we thereby get an idea of an unconditioned, okay? An unconditioned totality of conditions, because by definition, it contains all of the conditions. Okay? So this all sounds very abstract, but it's going to get less abstract. So let's take that first conditioning relation, whole of space to part of space. Well, chain up that grounding relation. We have a part of space to a whole, to a larger whole, to a larger whole, to a larger whole, to a larger whole. The complete totality of conditions would be either a sequence of larger and larger spaces that goes on infinitely, or it would stop at a certain point, and it would be a largest space. Yeah. Let's take the second one, previous moments in time. Let's take the previous moment in time, that either goes on infinitely, it's an infinite preceding chain of times, or it stops at a certain point, and that's the first moment of time. The third one, parts to whole, either the parts go on infinitely or they stop at a certain point, and there are parts that are not themselves wholes. Mm-hmm. The fourth one, causation, either the causes go back infinitely and there's an infinite sequence of causes, or there's a first cause that has no cause, there's an uncaused cause. And now let's take the relationship between a contingent and something that necessitates it. Either it's a contingent necessitated by something that is itself necessitated, or something that's self-necessitated, and then you have an infinite sequence of contingent things going back all the way, or it terminates in a necessary being that makes everything else necessary. Okay, so now we have, for each of these grounding relations, 2 options. Okay? And the question is, which one of them holds? Okay? Now, those 5 grounding relations generate 4 of what Kant calls antinomial conflicts of pure reason. And it generates 4 because Kant combines the space and time relationship into one, because they structurally work exactly the same. Okay?
Yeah.
So we have one antinomial conflict is the complete sequence of spaces goes on forever, and the complete sequence of previous moments of time goes on forever, or the complete sequence of spaces terminates at a biggest space, and the complete sequence of previous times terminates at a first time. Okay? So that's what Kant calls an antinomial conflict, because they appear to be, well, they're inconsistent, and they appear to be exhaustive. It appears to be that either one has to be the case or the other has to be the case. And Kant thinks that you can prove, if you assume one of them, you can prove that this is false, and you've proved this is true. You can assume this is true. You can prove the other one is false. Okay? So what we have here is it looks like a paradox or an antinomy. It looks like reason is required to assert both P and not P. Okay. Now, what does Kant want to show with the antinomial conflicts of pure reason? He wants to show that a particular view is false. He wants to show that the view that objects in space and time are things in themselves is false. Okay? He's already shown this to be false earlier in the book, but this part of the book called The Antinomial Conflicts of Pure Reason is supposed to be an indirect proof that objects in space and time are not things in themselves. So the view that objects in space and time are not things in themselves is what Kant calls transcendental idealism. That is his view. The alternative view that they are things in themselves is called transcendental realism. So the antinomial conflicts of pure reason is supposed to constitute an indirect proof of transcendental idealism against transcendental realism. Okay. So now, Kant's claim is that if you're a transcendental realist, this is let's take that first antinomial conflict. Either the sequence of spaces goes on forever, goes on infinitely, the complete set of spatial conditions for a given space goes on infinitely, or it terminates. Mm-hmm. Same thing for time, but I'll just focus on space for now. Kant thinks if you're a transcendental realist, objects in space and time are things in themselves. So the set of all of the conditions of a given thing in itself also has to exist. So that sequence has to be either finite or it has to be infinite. And it can't be finite and it can't be infinite. Because if you assume that it's finite, you can prove that it's infinite. And if you assume that it's finite, you can prove that it's infinite. I think I'm switching my hands. So if you're a transcendental realist, Kant thinks this antinomial conflict is a contradiction. You can prove that the complete set of conditions is finite and that it's infinite. He also thinks the same thing about the second antinomial conflict, the relationship between the parts and a whole. If you're a transcendental realist, the complete sequence of all the parts of a thing has to exist. It's a thing in itself. Whether it exists is totally independently of us. So the set of all the parts of this is a set. That set is either finite or infinite. If we assume that it's not finite, we can prove that it's infinite. And if we prove that it's not infinite, we can prove that it's finite. So we have these contradictory indirect proofs. Okay? So if we're a transcendental realist, we get a contradiction. Likewise for the other antinomial conflicts. Kant's way out of the antinomial conflicts, using transcendental idealism, is that the complete sequence of conditions for an object in space and time doesn't exist, because the only objects that exist in space and time are objects of possible experience. And we cannot experience an unconditioned object. Okay, so now, what does that mean in practice? Or what does that mean more concretely? Let's take the first antinomial conflict and the first conditioning relation. Larger space to smaller space. Okay? So Kant thinks for every space that we can experience a larger space. But that means no matter how far we go, so think of these sequences as sort of ever larger experiences of ever bigger experiences. Each element in the series is a possible experience. but the whole series itself is not a possible objective experience. So the complete totality of the spaces that condition a given space, there is no such thing. Right? Mm-hmm. So Kant will sometimes call that, all of these ways, all of these objects that we're talking about in the antinomial conflicts, the complete sequence of, say, all the spaces that condition a given space, are ways of talking about the world. They're conceptions of the cosmos. They're the cosmos as, say, a spatial totality. This cosmos as a temporal totality. Kant thinks that the cosmos, the totality of objects in space and time, is not an object in space and time. And consequently, there is no such object. Because the only objects there are in space and time are objects that we can possibly experience. Experience requires intuition, and any intuition of a particular space is an intuition of a space that has a condition. So if you just think about this, I mean, one way of thinking about this is the transcendental realist assumes that because these things that are in these relations are things in themselves, the complete set or totality of all the things that are in that relation exists. That set has to exist. Kant denies that. In sort of set, if it helps to think of this in terms of sets, Kant thinks that all of the finite sets exist. For every one of the finite sets exist, and no biggest set exists. Which means that every part of space is conditioned by something larger, so there isn't a last element. But that doesn't mean there's a big space that contains everything. Likewise for time. Every time has a previous time, but that doesn't mean there's a complete sequence with infinite times in it. Mm-hmm. There's just, for any sequence of time, there's a sequence of time that contains it. Likewise for material things. It isn't that there's infinitely many parts of this, and it isn't that there are smallest parts that themselves contain no parts. It's that at any place where you cut this thing, it has a part. Yeah. And that's going to be true of anything. So there's this thing, there's its parts, there's its parts, there's its parts, there's its parts. There's no complete sequence of there's no complete set of all those parts, and there's no atomic parts. Now, those are the first two antinomial conflicts, which are about space and time and about parts. Mm-hmm. The Kant's solution to those is different than his solution to the second two antinomial conflicts. The reason his solution is different is because those two antinomial conflicts, which involve, in the case of the first one, space and time, and the second one, parthood, require that the things that are conditions and the things that are conditioned, or the things that are grounds and the things that are consequences, be homogeneous in the sense that both have to be in space and time. Most obviously, with respect to the first antinomy, the spatial conditions of a given space have to be spatial, the temporal conditions of a given time have to be temporal. Less obviously, but still intuitively at least, the parts of a spatial thing have to be in space. So his solution to those two is the totality of all the conditions is not a possible of objective experience, so there is no such totality. So both sides of the antinomial conflict are false, because they're about something that doesn't exist. There is no complete totality in space or time. So, a fortiori, it's not the case that the complete totality is finite or the complete totality is infinite. With the first two antinomies, both what he calls the thesis and the antithesis, the respective statements that the thing is finite or infinite, are both false. With respect to the second two antinomies, that feature that the condition has to be in space and time, if the conditioned is in space and time, doesn't hold. So that this allows us to make a distinction between thinking of the sequence in space and time and thinking of it outside of space and time. Okay? So now think of the third antinomy. The third antinomy says every event has a cause preceding it. Kant can think that's true in space and time, while it's possible that outside of space and time, there are causes that are not effects. Okay? Because the cause of a spatiotemporal effect doesn't need to be in space and time. And so this is a little weird, but the idea is, in the third antinomy, we're wondering whether something that happens in space and time, we're thinking about its cause, and the cause of that, and the cause of that, and the cause of that. If we just go along the spatiotemporal causes of a spatiotemporal effect, it might be, and Kant thinks he has a proof, that every spatiotemporal cause is also a spatiotemporal effect. That is to say, the sequence of spatiotemporal causes and effects goes back indefinitely far.
Yeah.
But we can entertain the thought, although we can't know, that the cause of some spatiotemporal effect is not spatiotemporal. Mm-hmm. There might be some thing in itself that causes something to happen in space and time. There might be a non-spatiotemporal cause of the spatiotemporal. And with respect to that sequence, we can think that it terminates, that there are uncaused first causes among the things in themselves. So whereas with the first two antinomies, both the thesis and the antithesis are both false, with respect to the third and fourth antinomy, the thesis and the antithesis can both be true. They're consistent. One of them about the spatiotemporal world, and the other one about things in themselves. So now go to the fourth antinomy. The same structure occurs. The fourth antinomy concerns the relationship between a contingent thing and something that makes it necessary. In the spatiotemporal world, Kant thinks that relation goes on indefinitely. Every contingent thing is necessitated by some previous contingent thing. In fact, it's cause. So the fourth antinomy basically just adds the notions of contingency and necessity to the third antinomy. It just modalizes the third antinomy. So in the spatiotemporal world, we just have this indefinitely extending back in the past sequence of contingent things, each of which necessitates something later than it in the sequence. But we can entertain the thought that in the things in themselves, there is a necessary being that isn't necessitated by anything else. There is a sort of like a first necessary being, namely God. So this means that with respect to the third and the fourth antinomy, we can entertain the thought that although objects in space and time extend indefinitely, or events in space and time extend indefinitely into the past, from effect to cause to cause to cause, from contingent to contingent to contingent to contingent, in the noumenal world, there's an uncaused first cause, namely freedom, and there's a necessary being that isn't necessitated by anything else, namely God. So the third and the fourth antinomy open up the possibility that we can think consistently that there is freedom and God in the noumenal world among the things in themselves. But we can't know whether that's the case.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in terms of the antinomies, I touched on that subject because then, when it comes to his ethics, Kant, in the Critique of Practical Reason, even though in the Critique of Pure Reason he has presented them as antinomies in terms of answering if God exists or not and if we have free will in that case, I mean, as you said, we can think about those things, but we can't answer them definitely. But then I guess that in his ethics, for us to be able to completely devolve, to develop our moral character, it is necessary that God exists, that our soul is immortal, and that we have free will, right? And so he gives a definite answer to that at the level of ethics, right?
Yes. So it's important to note, and I'm probably to blame for not having made this explicit, that everything that Kant says about knowledge, cognition, our capacities in the Critique of Pure Reason operates under an implicit qualification. These are the theoretical uses or the theoretical manifestations of these capacities. Now, what does that mean? It means that the Critique of Pure Reason is about theory. What is theory? It's cognition in which you try to get things right. So in theoretical cognition, you are answerable to a standard given to you from outside by the object. So the aim or another way of putting this is in theoretical cognition, we don't create the objects. We try to get them right. Something is given to us from outside, and we try to get it right about what is given to us from outside. Mm-hmm. So everything that I've said up to that point is about the theoretical uses of our faculties in that way, right? So theoretical reason is reasoning about what is. It's trying to infer to the existence of a condition for some condition. Kant's practical philosophy is about the practical use of our faculties. What is the difference between practical and the theoretical use of our faculties? In the practical use of our faculties, we represent the object of cognition as to be brought about by that very cognition. Right? So in what Kant would call practical cognition, which is cognizing some object as to be done, right? I am going to do this. You are representing that object as to exist. That object will exist, and it will exist because of your representation. Right? So the relationship between the object and the cognition is different. In practical reason or practical cognition, practical representation makes the object exist. It's practical. It's to do something in the world. It's not receptive in the way it is in theoretical cognition, where some object is given to you and you try to get it right. You try to be adequate to the object given to you from outside. Okay, so now in the critique of practical reason, Kant turns towards the practical manifestation or the practical use of these capacities. Your audience, if they're familiar with Kant's writings, is probably more familiar with Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals than they are with the critique of practical reason. And I just want to say something about the relationship between these two texts. Kant spends most of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals explaining how it could be that an unconditioned moral law, which takes the form of a categorical imperative in relation to us, is possible. What's an unconditional moral law? It's a moral law that is binding on us or applies to us unconditionally. That is to say, it is inescapable. There is it doesn't apply to you because you are a certain kind of being, or because you are have a certain kind of desires, or because you have a certain kind of practical identity. It's binding on all rational beings as such. It's just binding on what it is to have a rational, have the practical reason, to be a practically rational being. It applies to God as well. Because we are capable, we sometimes don't do what a moral law tells us to do. If there's a moral law, our relationship to it is an imperative. It tells us what we ought to do. But it's a categorical imperative, because it doesn't say you ought to do this if you want such and such. It just tells us you ought to do this. It is not hypothetical in any way. It's just a pure ought. Okay? So most of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals is Kant are explaining how it could be that a categorical imperative is possible for us. Now, the critique of practical reason has this structure that a lot of people find dissatisfying. I find it kind of fantastic, which is it just begins by asserting what Kant calls the fact of reason, which is a fact of practical reason, which is that our practical reason immediately recognizes itself as bound by an unconditional moral law, which therefore takes the form of a categorical imperative with respect to us. So in other words, Kant thinks that practical reason just of itself recognizes this moral law. Now, if you think that's impossible, or why should I ever think the practical reason recognizes an unconditional moral law, read the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. The critique of reason just starts there. Yeah. The relationship between is a little bit more complicated than that, but let me just start with it. So the critique of practical reason starts from this point of the fact of reason. Practical reason immediately recognizes itself as bound by an unconditional moral law, which therefore takes the form of a categorical imperative. And you can spell out what that categorical imperative is in a couple of different ways. Okay? But the more important thing is that Kant thinks that the fact of reason, practical reason's immediate recognition of itself as bound by a moral law, brings with it practical reason's awareness of itself as being free, as having a capacity for free will. Okay. Now, what does free will here mean? For our purposes, the most important thing is that it means that none of your actions are made necessary by something more basic than that. Okay? So your will, when some action of yours, would be unfree if it was impossible for you not to do that at the time that you did it. Okay. Now, why does the boundness of our will by the moral law entail that we're free? Well, because Kant thinks that because we're finite beings, we're not God, the moral law takes the form of an ought with respect to us. It tells us what we ought to do. The moral law merely describes what God does. It doesn't give him an ought because it's impossible for God not to do it. Okay? So the ought is the moral law's relationship to us because it's possible for us to disobey it sometimes, and Kant thinks always we do bad things. So we ought to do what the moral law tells us. Okay? But Kant thinks ought implies can. Okay? So now just to go back to something that I talked about at the very beginning, take some case where you do something bad. Kant thinks in almost all cases you do something bad. Okay? So you tell a lie when you should have told the truth. So if we just restrict ourselves to space, so Kant's point is you ought to have told the truth, which means you could have told the truth. It was possible for you to have told the truth. Okay? That's what the ought implies can principle means. You had the ability to tell the truth. Okay? But now, if we restrict our attention to the spatio-temporal world, Kant thinks, you couldn't have done otherwise. You don't have the freedom to have done otherwise. Because if we restrict our attention to the spatio-temporal world, your action of lying is just another thing that occurs in space and time. And so it has a previous cause, which necessitates it, which has a previous cause which necessitates it. So the relevant sense of possibility here is, given the past plus the laws of nature, could you have done otherwise? And Kant thinks because events in space and time are governed by deterministic causal laws, you could not have done otherwise at that moment. So if we restrict our attention to the spatio-temporal world, you couldn't have done otherwise. You don't have freedom, so the ought does not apply to you. So if the spatio-temporal world was all there was, the moral law would not apply to us. But practical reason knows of itself that the moral law applies to it. So we would be doomed. Reason would contradict itself if the spatio-temporal world were the only thing we could think about. But we've proven in the Critique of Pure Reason that although we can't have theoretical knowledge of things in themselves, we can think about them because we have concepts of them, even if we don't have intuitions of them. So that means we can think that considered as things in themselves, considered as an object that exists independently of whether it intuits itself, I have a capacity of free will to act contrary to how I actually act. That makes it the case that I have the free will required for the moral law to apply to me. So I'm deterministic. My actions are deterministically governed at the level of space and time, but I can think at the level of things in themselves that I'm free. But I can do more than think because practical reason has the strongest kind of knowledge that practical reason is capable of. It's kind of the paradigm of practical knowledge that I'm bound by a moral law. And I'm bound by a moral law only if I'm free. Yeah. So that practical knowledge of my freedom is practical knowledge that as a thing in itself I'm free. And that's consistent with the denial of theoretical knowledge of things in themselves because they're about different things. Theoretical knowledge is of the spatio-temporal. Practical knowledge is of the nature of my character as a noumenal being, a thing in itself that has practical reason. Now, it's also it's important to note that I just want to note that the way this works is in the theoretical philosophy, the space of thought, the space of conceptualization is wide open. I can think about things in themselves, but I can't know about them. Okay? And then what practical reason does in the critique of pure reason is take that thought and give us knowledge that it's the case, or at least cognition, practical cognition that I have free will, that nothing outside of my will determines me to will the way that I do, and that in the very same circumstances, I could have willed otherwise. So that is how we get from determinism at the level of the sensible world, via the moral law, to freedom as a thing in itself. But Kant thinks the moral law, in addition, so the moral law has a kind of negative aspect and a positive aspect. It commands you to not do a lot of things. People usually focus on the negative aspect of Kant's morality because it's very strict, and I think they don't read the rest of the book. But there's also a positive element to Kant's moral philosophy. The moral law requires that you set yourself certain ends. Yeah. One of those ends is what Kant calls the highest good. What's the highest good? The highest good is what Kant calls the complete object of practical reason. What's the complete object of practical reason? What's the complete object of practical cognition? Remember, practical cognition is the cognition of something as to be done. Right? It's the cognition of something as to do it. You cognize something as to do when you cognize it as good. Right? So theoretical cognition is the cognition of something as true. Practical cognition is the cognition of something as good, worth doing, or choice-worthy. Kant thinks that the good has two aspects. It has a form and it has a matter. The form of the good is given by the moral law itself. That means nothing that violates the moral law could possibly be good. It could possibly be an object of practical cognition. The morality puts kind of negative constraints on any possible object of choice. Nothing that violates those constraints could be worth doing. But the moral law doesn't completely determine the object of choice. So think about this, you can do this or you can do that. You could walk to the left or you could walk to the right. Both of them are equally allowed by morality. But that's because practical reason, or the will, doesn't just have a form, it also has a matter. Okay? And the matter, or the substance, substance is the wrong word, that was unfortunate. The matter of practical reason is given by your desires. Okay? So the morality is something like the structure that we impose on our given desires, such that what results from that is morally acceptable. Okay, so morality sort of determines certain things as out of bounds, but within what's in bounds, it doesn't determine what you should do. Then what's good or what's worth doing within the bounds of morality is what you desire to do. And so the complete object of practical cognition is not just morality, it's morality plus the satisfaction of your desires and the satisfaction of others' desires, because others' desires are just as morally worth satisfying as yours. And it's not just partial satisfaction of your desires. The highest object of practical cognition, the highest, most choice-worthy thing, would be a thing in which your desires are maximally satisfied and the desires of others are maximally satisfied. But conditional upon your being good and their being good. And not just conditional upon, proportionate to. Kant thinks that the satisfaction of your desires is good only if, and to the extent that you're morally good. So the highest good, the complete object of practical cognition, which has both the form and the matter of practical cognition, is happiness, desire satisfaction, proportional to and because of morality. Yeah. That's what the highest good is for Kant. Very roughly put, the highest good for Kant is the situation in which all finite practical agents, us, are happy, that is to say, have their desires satisfied, to the extent that, and because of, their degree of moral goodness. Now, the moral law commands us to set that as an end. That's the highest thing that we could ever aim at in will. And so it would be irrational not to aim at it. That doesn't mean we're ever going to accomplish it, but it's something that we have to aim practical reason at. That's the thing we all have to be going towards. But Kant thinks if you set an end, you're rationally required to believe that that end is possible. It would be irrational to set an end but think that that end is impossible to achieve. Right? So it would be impossible to set as the end the revolution while not believing the revolution was possible. Mm-hmm. And since reason requires that we set this end, reason requires that we believe that this end is possible. The highest good, the situation in which everyone is happy in proportion to and because of their moral goodness. But, Kant thinks, if we are the only things that exist, finite moral rational agents, then the highest good is not possible. Because we can't proportion happiness to our moral goodness. Because I don't know how morally good you are. I can't look into your soul and know the quality of your will as a noumenal agent and know whether you are really morally good or whether you're merely pretending to be morally good or you seem to be morally good. I can't even know that about myself. I don't really know whether I'm acting out of respect for the moral law or whether I'm merely acting in conformity with it. So, and furthermore, we just don't have the ability to proportion happiness to moral desert. So, we're required to believe that the highest good is possible. If we were the only things that existed, it wouldn't be possible. So we're rationally required to believe in something that makes the highest good possible. What would make the highest good possible? It would have to be something that knows omnisciently our moral desert, is omnipotent with respect to apportioning happiness to moral worth, and is omnibenevolent in that it would actually do that. It wouldn't just sort of see the possibility of bringing the highest good about and just not do it. So we have to believe in an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, noumenal being that makes the highest good possible. That's God.
Yeah.
Now, furthermore, the highest good is the situation in which we're all maximally happy, but in proportion to and because of our moral goodness. But moral goodness requires, because we are kind of permanently prone to this tendency to not act according to the moral law, but just subordinate the moral law to our own interests, it requires moral striving. And the sort of ideal moral goodness that would be involved in the highest good in ideals involves kind of infinite moral striving. No finite lifetime or finite sequence of finite lifetimes would ever get us enough moral striving that would make us worthy of the highest good. So, since we're rationally required to believe the highest good is possible, we're rationally required to believe that I, as a thing in itself, as a noumenal rational agent, am capable of participating in the highest good. And since no rational finite lifetime nor finite sequence of rational lifetimes would ever give me enough opportunity for moral striving to make myself fit to be part of the highest good, I have to believe that my noumenal self will exist after the end of my finite lifetime in time and will outlive any finite number of finite lifetimes. So immortal. I have my rational noumenal agency I have to believe exists outside of time and is kind of, although God could destroy it, won't destroy it. So this is all a complicated way of saying that practical reason's immediate recognition of itself as bound by the moral law gives it reasons to believe that there is a God and that it is immortal. Practical rational agency. But those beliefs fall short of knowledge. They fall short of knowledge both on the theoretical side and the practical side. On the theoretical side, they clearly fall short of knowledge because they are about God and an immortal noumenal substance or noumenal soul that we can't possibly intuit, we can't possibly experience, therefore we can't have theoretical knowledge of. And they also fall short of the highest standard of practical knowledge, because the highest standard of practical knowledge, practical cognition, is our immediate cognition of ourselves as bound by the moral law and our cognition of ourselves as free, as noumenal beings. What Kant calls the postulate of the existence of God and the postulate of the immortality of the soul are things we're rationally required to believe. Mm-hmm. So one difference between them and our practical cognition of our freedom is, if God and immortality are false, then we're still bound by the moral law, and we still have to believe that we're free. It's just that we have to set ourselves an end to the highest good that we can never achieve. Okay? So to speak, if they fell away, morality would still be there. It would just have this function, this feature where it set us an end that we couldn't achieve. So they are sort of less intimately bound up with morality and freedom. And so we don't have cognition of them. We don't have knowledge of them. We have something like practically warranted belief, but that's still quite strong. So this is a point on which I think people often get confused, which is Kant is not saying it's good for morality to believe that there's a God or to believe that you have an immortal soul. That's way too weak. Kant is saying you are rationally required by morality itself to believe this. Mm-hmm. But you're much more than rationally required to believe that morality is binding on you or that you're free. Practical reason just contains within itself an immediate awareness of itself as bound by the moral law and as free. So the God and immortality are less central than that, but they're not sort of, merely pragmatically warranted. Like Kant, Kant is not just saying it would be good if everyone believed this.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so we've already spoke for 2 hours now. Yeah. Let me just ask you maybe one last question. I know that beforehand we agreed that we would touch a little bit on Hegel, but yeah. I guess that we will not have enough time today to do that. But let me just ask you this, still about trying to bring about all of the Kantian canon, let's say, in terms of his metaphysics and epistemology and morality. Maybe 2 questions. First of all, in terms of metaphysics, where would moral laws fall? Would moral laws for Kant also be some sort of metaphysical entity? Would they be, could we say that they are instantiated in existence or in the universe itself, that they are things in themselves? Yeah. And on the other hand, particularly when it comes to the relationship between what we can and we can't know, and because from David Hume we get that what some people call the is-ought dichotomy, that is, just to oversimplify it a little bit, that we can't derive value judgments directly from factual judgments. That is, we can't derive, for example, moral laws or moral truths from the knowledge we acquire about how existence is or how the world works, something like that. Would Kant say, you think, that we could do that we can derive an ought from an is?
So that's very complicated, and it's complicated by what you mean by an is. The smart-ass answer is to say, well, from the fact that I am bound by a moral law, it follows that I ought to obey the moral law, because that's just what a moral law is, right? So we have to be careful that the idea of the is-ought gap can seem way more straightforward than it really is. And the reason is that we're implicitly assuming some distinction between something like descriptive vocabulary or vocabulary that doesn't have oughts already built into it, and vocabulary that either explicitly involves an ought or has an ought built into it. And the idea is somehow from the former, you can't infer the latter. Appropriately construed, that's true of Kant, I think, although there are places where Kant suggests that you can derive the ought of the moral law from a fact about our metaphysical constitution. Namely, we are sort of rational beings that are also sensible. That is to say, that are also passive with respect to objects outside us and with respect to ourselves. So that if we didn't have sensibility and we just had pure practical reason, we would obey the moral law. We would be something like angels, or maybe even God himself. But we have sensibility added on top of it, and so the moral law merely has the form of an ought with respect to us. There are places where Kant seems to suggest that you can't derive an ought from an is, but you can derive it from a sort of counterfactual. We are sensible and rational. If we were only sensible, we would obey the moral law. Therefore, we ought to obey the moral law. I don't think that I try to read Kant against that. I don't think that's a very satisfying picture. I want to understand those places in Kant as saying something more minimal, namely that counterfactual claim is something like an explanation, is a way of explaining how the ought can apply to us, even though we also have a sensible side. So that's not what explains why the ought applies to us, or it's not what the ought is derived from. So where Kant falls on the is-ought thing is more complicated than is sometimes apparent. What is very straightforward is that no ought claim follows from an is claim if the is restricted to the spatiotemporal world, right? If we just restrict ourselves to descriptions in spatiotemporal terms of spatiotemporal things, no ought follows from that. If that's what the is-ought gap means, then Kant is 100% on board. Okay. You also asked me about the metaphysical status of moral laws. Well, one of the things that's really interesting about Kant, and I really didn't emphasize, is that one of the things that Kant is trying to do throughout his critical system is reorient some philosophical questions from questions about entities or beings outside of us towards questions about the role that certain kinds of principles play in reason. Okay? So the very simple version of this is you would think that metaphysics is about some stuff outside of us. In fact, everything. Inside us, outside us, absolutely everything. Kant wants to sort of back off from that for a second and notice that what is characteristic of metaphysics is that its judgments have a certain kind of form. They are synthetic, that is to say, they don't follow from the definitions of the concepts involved, and they're a priori. We don't know them by observing anything. Okay? So a lot of what Kant is doing in his account of metaphysics is giving an account of how synthetic a priori judgments are possible and the role that they play in our rational faculty. And in a certain sense, once he's explained that, he thinks he's explained what he needs to explain about the objects. So another way of putting that is the question about cause and effect for Kant is ultimately a question about how synthetic a priori principles involving the notions of cause and effect, what role they play in our rational faculty and what they make possible. And now that is kind of the fundamental thing from which we derive some things about objects in space and time and their causal relations. So likewise, if we move to the moral side of things, it's not like the moral law is something out there. Okay? It's not some entity. The way we approach the moral law is by approaching this question of what role certain principles of practical cognition play in practical cognition, and whether there are a priori principles of practical cognition. And Kant thinks they are, and those a priori principles of practical cognition are the moral law. So in a sense, they're not entities, but that also doesn't mean they're not entities in us. They're not like states of us, nor are they states of our noumenal substance. An account of the moral law is something like an account of the role that certain a priori principles play in practical reason as such. And then if you ask, what is the ontological status of that, then it's not really clear what ontological status means, because the moral law isn't a being, fundamentally. It, in a certain way, characterizes a kind of being, namely a practical will, or sorry, a rational will. But in a certain way, that kind of way of thinking about that, of kind of ontologizing Kant's conception of a moral law, obscures more than it clarifies, because Kant always wants to, or ultimately wants to, bring back all of these questions about objects, both objects of practical cognition and objects of theoretical cognition, to questions about the capacities and the activations of those capacities that make it possible for reason to represent those things. So it's not that reason is an entity or isn't an entity for Kant. It's somehow not particularly helpful to think of it as either way, because Kant thinks the most fundamental thing that we do in philosophy is articulate the principles by which reason operates, and which thereby make it possible for reason to entertain thoughts, cognitions, knowledge, practical cognition, practical rational belief about entities. I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question, but it's a way of saying that it's not clear that question about the ontological status of the moral law for Kant has a Kantian answer. I think what Kant would say is the moral law is the law of practical reason. Now, what is practical reason? Well, it is a capacity that certain noumenal substances have, yes. But does that explain what it is? No, because reason is what makes it so much as possible for us to even entertain thoughts of substances in the first place. So in a certain way, it's explanatorily prior to any notion of substance or thing in which you might house practical reason. Okay? Now, then you asked me about Hegel. That is an extremely large topic of conversation, because Hegel is himself his own universe, even more complicated than Kant's. I think significantly more complicated than Kant. There's many ways of thinking about the relationship between Kant and Hegel. There's a way of thinking about the relationship between Kant and Hegel in every part of Kant's philosophy. Because in every part of Kant's philosophy, Hegel sees Kant as having made a revolutionary advance over his predecessors, right, as being the latest and most important step in philosophy, behind which we can't ever go. We can never return to pre-Kantian philosophy. But as also having kind of ruined his own most crucial insights by retaining something that isn't ultimately compatible with them. So that often has the following structure. Kant thinks that there's a spontaneity in our faculties, or a spontaneity in reason. But that spontaneity is restricted by something external to it, or is sensitive to something external to it. In theoretical philosophy, that takes the idea that we are affected by things in themselves that are external to our rational capacities, but bring our rational capacities into activation. In practical philosophy, that's the idea that there's practical reason, which gives itself the moral law, which is the immediate awareness of itself as bound by the moral law. And then there's something that's external to practical reason, strictly speaking. There's the desires we merely happen to have. Mm-hmm. So in both cases, there's this distinction between a form, which is active, and a matter, which is passively given. One very broad structural way of thinking about Hegel in relation to Kant is Hegel wants to get rid of the receptive aspect of Kant's philosophy. He wants to think that the form of reason itself generates its own matter. Now, what the hell does that mean? And why did I say the form of reason rather than the form of theoretical reason or the form of practical reason? Because once again, just as Kant thinks there's this distinction between matter and form, between sensibility and receptivity, he also thinks there's a distinction between the theoretical employment of reason and the practical employment of reason. Although Kant thinks they're both employments of one and the same faculty, it's just that we have to theorize the two different faces separately, and then can't say very much, very satisfyingly, about their common root, reason itself. Kant, in all of these Hegel in all these cases wants to go back to something more basic than the Kantian distinctions and generate them out of that more basic thing. So the form of reason itself generates the thing that Kant would call its matter, but shouldn't really be called matter because it's not given to reason from anything outside reason. And the distinction between theoretical and practical reason itself is generated out of reason itself. We start from the sort of point of indifference between theoretical and practical reason and work out why there would be theoretical and practical reason. Okay, now what the hell does that even mean? That sounds totally insane. Well, the one relatively concrete way of thinking about it is just to go back to something that I said almost in passing about Kant that made it sound like it was some kind of platitude, and which Hegel doesn't think a platitude at all. And that's the idea that understanding, which is for Kant a capacity of thinking, is kind of empty unless it receives something from outside to think about. So Kant thinks that the science that studies just the form of thinking, abstracting from any content it receives from outside, he calls that pure general logic. That's what we now just call logic. Although it's in many ways very different than what we now call logic. And Kant thinks that logic just studies a form of thought without any content. It just studies these barely formal features of thought. Hegel thinks, I think, on my reading of Hegel, that Kant in a certain way spoiled that really crucial insight that thought can study just its own form by thinking that it needed to receive some content from outside. And he spoiled that by not seeing that when thought thinks its own form, that form generates a content of itself. Okay? So another way of thinking about this, that Kant thinks that pure general logic, which is something like, according to Kant, this relatively uninteresting study of these bare syllogistic forms that judgments can stand in with respect to one another, he thinks in order for that to constitute cognition, it needs to receive something from outside to work on, to be about. Hegel thinks, no, logic, understood as the science of thought, is not that boring formal study of syllogistic forms. It generates all of the things that thought as such must think about. And that is actually sufficient for metaphysics. Because this is a point, in a certain way, that Kant saw, but then overlooked. Because Kant thinks pure general logic, of course, applies to things in themselves. Things in themselves don't violate the law of non-contradiction. How could they? It's unthinkable that they could. Now, and that's not a subject, that's not like unthinkable for us. There is no thought that is the thought that things in themselves violate the law of non-contradiction. So trivially, it's not a true thought. It's not that we don't know whether things in themselves violate the law of non-contradiction. It's just unthinkable. So what Hegel, I think, saw in Kant was the possibility that if thought just by itself could do something more than just the law of non-contradiction, if it could determine of itself that it has to think in a far more specific or far more determinate way, then we would be able to say of all those determinate ways that thought has to think, that's just how everything has to be. Because it's unthinkable that it's the alternative, that there's any alternative. It's not just that we don't know whether the alternative obtains or not. Trying to think the alternative isn't thinking at all. You're just making noise. So that, in a certain way, logic itself could be adequate. It could just be metaphysics itself. But in order to get that off the ground, Hegel has to have this idea that thought in thinking itself, that's the science of logic, makes all of these has to think all this very determinate content just in order to be thought. And that's what Kant didn't see and denied. And whether that works depends upon the detailed working out of the project in which Hegel tries to carry out that book called The Science of Logic. So the science of logic, one way of thinking about the science of logic is it's an attempt to just do all of metaphysics just out of thought thinking itself, just out of logic, without this Kantian distinction between understanding and sensibility. And that's a very ambitious project, and you could have varying degrees of optimism about how well it's going to go. I'm more optimistic than many others about the success of Hegel's Science of Logic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Stang, what about ending it now? because we've already went for 2 hours and almost 20 minutes, so we covered a lot of ground on Kantian metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and on our way we also talked a little bit about some of the biggest questions in all of those areas, all of those branches of...
Okay, that sounds great.
Of philosophy. So before we go, I mean, are there any good places on the internet where people can find your work if they're interested?
All of my work is on my academia.edu and Phil Papers page, and most of those links link to the actual papers, which people can just download. I think, and if anyone wants a copy and they don't have library access, they can just email me. I'm very willing to distribute stuff. So yeah.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Stang, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show. And
thanks so much.
It was a very interesting conversation.
Listen to all of that.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jane Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart, my 3 producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank, and my executive producer, Mikhail Ruzieski. Thank you for all.